7. Subjugation of the Indians and Métis. In order to build the railroad across the prairies, Ottawa had to control land that belonged to natives. As long as the Plains Indians remained strong and capable of defending their rights and their lands, they presented, together with the Métis, a formidable opposition to the imperialist dreams of Ottawa and London. But the strengths of the Métis and the Indians depended on an abundant supply of food on the prairies, and it was the buffalo that provided most of the people's needs. The skins were used for clothing, teepees, and bedding. Cooking utensils and sleds were made from the bones. Very little of the animal was wasted. Of greatest importance, however, was the meat, which was the main source of native food, since native people had based their economy on the buffalo hunt. As long as the buffalo was plentiful, there was little reason for concern. But by the 1870s, overhunting had so reduced the buffalo herds around Red River that the hunters were going as far as the Cypress Hills region of southern Saskatchewan for the pemmican on which the fur traders, as well as the hunters, depended. It is well known that the United States, its armies, and its government deliberately exterminated the buffalo in order to exterminate the Indians who lived on it. This may have been one of the reasons why many Canadian herds migrated to the grazing lands south of the border. However, the Canadian government was following a policy similar to that of the American government, but with less violence and devastation. It is possible that the mounted police were herding the buffalo across the international boundary, where they knew the buffalo would be slaughtered. Certainly, the increasing export of buffalo hides to the northern United States accelerated the destruction of the Canadian herds. By 1885, when the railroad was completed across Canada, the buffalo was virtually extinct, and the Indians and Métis who had depended on it were starving. The sudden and systematic slaughter of the buffalo certainly helped to serve Ottawa's plan. Also, the confinement of the Indians and Métis to reserves and rural ghettos immediately after the slaughter makes it hard to believe that the two events were coincidental. Too many pieces of the imperial plan fitted together too neatly. The truth about the historical situation in the United States very probably applied to Canada as well, but the overwhelming force and firepower brought against the tribes, together with the systematic slaughter of the buffalo herds, the Indian source of food, and the basis of their way of life, finally ended their ability to resist. With their power broken and their food supply gone, they were gradually confined by the American government on reservations. After the slaughter of the buffalo, the Indians and half-breeds were virtually prisoners and beggars, dependent upon the charity and patronage of their white colonizers. Not only were the native people denied their land and economy, but they were also denied the right to participate in the mainstream agricultural and industrial activity of Canada. Even construction work on the railroad was denied them. Instead, cheap coolie labor was imported, while native people by the thousands were confined to rural prisons. The death of the buffalo meant the death of the native people's freedom and independence on the prairies. With the end of the buffalo came the end of the unofficial command the Métis held over the hunting territory. Their administration and policy making was now restricted to their local communities. The political sovereignty over the plains that they took for granted because of the buffalo economy had now been eliminated by Ottawa authorities. To complete its expansion plan, Ottawa needed the vast Northwest lands, not only for the CPR, but also as an agricultural area for immigrants. Since a market was needed for manufactured goods, European settlers were needed to perform the function of consumers. Once the buffalo were gone, the native people were reduced to complete dependency on whites, and the treaties served to justify the seizure of Indian lands. It was government policy to locate reserves on rocky, sandy, and hilly land. Because half-breeds were not considered Aboriginal people, they were not placed on reserves, but were confined on farm colonies and rural ghettos. Some half-breeds were left with no alternative but to become squatters on road allowances. Very few half-breeds took up homesteads, because the intention behind such land settlement plans was to exclude most of the indigenous people who had Aboriginal claims. In the first place, the half-breeds did not have the required down payment, small as it was. But, more important, the half-breeds had lived in the Northwest Territories long before the government surveyed the land and implemented its homestead policies. Half-breeds had moved into the Saskatchewan area shortly after the Red River struggle in 1870. They selected sites along the river which they divided into river lots. They built homes and developed their farms. As far as they were concerned, this land belonged to them. Nevertheless, the requirements to qualify for a homestead were restrictive, in the sense that certain bureaucratic and legal matters were involved. Also, homestead regulations demanded that a set number of acres had to be cleared, broken, and cultivated within 3 years. This regulation alone made it almost prohibitive for half-breeds to own homesteads because they lacked the machinery and tools to fulfill such development requirements. Half-breeds were allowed to buy their river lots after April 1885. Superintendent Pierce of the Department of the Interior stated on 14th December 1885 that every Dominion Lands Act which has been in force has contained a provision making it an illegal proceeding to settle on land subsequent to survey, without first obtaining entry thereto. Many Métis families settled on the South Saskatchewan River in the 1870s and had unofficially divided their land into river lots. Therefore, they were residents or squatters before any survey was made. There was considerable delay in granting entries to the half-breeds because of the problems surrounding One Arrow's Indian Reserve, which was near Batoche. Pierce stated, it was not till November 1884 that entries could be granted them. When the plan was sent to the agents in March 1884, so much time had elapsed after the survey had been done on the ground that it was feared complication might arise, and, as the results proved, disputes over certain of the claims had arisen. Therefore, I, at the date, verbally instructed Mr. Duck not to grant entry until he had gone through the entire parish and obtained the evidence necessary to adjust such disputes. So much time has been occupied in obtaining the requisite evidence, as has been explained, that the parties were not notified till late in the following February or early in March 1885. Entries were only applications for grants of land and not patents. Therefore, it was impossible for the half-breeds of Batoche to obtain titles to the land before the uprising took place. The government had separate policies for the treaty/status Indians and for the Métis. Indians were treated as primitives who could not be assimilated into white Euro-American society. They were segregated and isolated from the mainstream, under a policy much like apartheid. The Métis, although treated on a racial basis as indigenous people, were considered half-white, and thus potentially assimilable. Treaties and reserves are common to all native people in colonies around the Third World, because they serve the purposes of colonization more efficiently than other forms of imperial conquest. In Canada, treaties legitimized the imprisonment of status Indians under white agents backed by police and soldiers. In return, the Indians received almost nothing for their land and resources except promises as empty as the treaties themselves. Negotiations satisfactory to two parties are not possible when power is unequally distributed between them. Ottawa officials were bargaining from a position of state power, backed by the mounted police and the combined military force of Canada and England. They were familiar with English language and legal contracts based on English law. The Indians, on the other hand, were powerless. They did not speak English. They were seriously divided, and they were economically dependent. They were on bended knee in supplication to the white negotiators. All this was called treaty negotiation. To most Indians who were forced to attend these spectacles, it was an agonizing experience of final surrender to the colonizer. Politically, they were unable to disagree with the terms the white officials dictated to them, but they were not fooled by beautiful speeches about the greatness of reserves or by promises of government charity and protection. Chief Big Bear stated that, before he signed the treaty, he had been promised by government officials as much land as he wanted, and wherever he wished to choose it. Without these conditions, Big Bear claimed that he would never have signed the treaty, and in the treaty negotiations, he took it for granted that these promises were being included as part of the treaty terms. However, the white authorities were still resorting to the old fur trading practice of bribes. At negotiation proceedings, Colonel Irvine of the NWMP called Big Bear into his office and gave him a present of $100 and a good horse. This was unprincipled bargaining in many ways. First, it was a bribe to get the chief to agree to the treaty, which automatically suggests that it was a poor deal for the Indians. Second, it was an expose of the kind of policies and principles employed by the federal government in dealing with Indians. Also, it showed the mentality of government authorities in that everything and everybody could be bought for a price. On the other hand, Big Bear was also at fault for accepting a horse and $100 as a bribe for selling the Aboriginal land and resources of his people. All in all, the Indian people were the losers. This is only one of the many deceitful practices that were used by white agents in negotiating with Indians for their land. While such bribes took place behind closed doors, Governor Alexander Morris was addressing crowds of Indians with flowery speeches behind an armed guard of mounted police. The following statements are typical of Morris's speeches. I see the Queen's counselor taking the Indian by the hand, saying we are brothers. We will lift you up. We will teach you, if you will learn the cunning of the white man. All along the road, I see Indians gathering. I see gardens growing and houses building. I see them receiving money from the Queen's commissioners to purchase clothing for their children. They, Crees, read my face, and through that my heart, and said my words were true, and they took my hand on behalf of the Queen. Since I was a young man, my heart was warm to the Indians, and I have taken a great interest in them. A few years later, the editor of the Saskatchewan Herald complained that the government Morris represented was restricting the Indians' hunting grounds and treating them as wards and incapable children. He claimed that the mortality rate of Indians was deplorable. Governor Morris's warm heart and great interest in the Indians seems to have turned cold and disinterested as soon as the Indians signed their land over. There are two distinct levels of operation in a colonial society. One is the level of rhetoric, ideals, and promises. The second is the level of the actual operation of the system, the daily struggle for existence. In most cases, these two levels remain separate and bear little relationship to each other. It is common for government officials who have power over the indigenous people to hold elaborate conferences in luxurious hotels and discuss Indian problems with the native elite. At such conferences, great promises are made to improve the conditions of the native people. Noble resolutions are passed for important changes and for social action that will result in considerable benefits to the rank-and-file natives. This is the level of promises and rhetoric. At the same time, the Indians and Métis masses in their ghettos are being humiliated by having to ask for a few extra dollars of welfare simply to exist. They know nothing of the conferences or of the great promises that will never be kept. The colonizer attributes the failures of his promised programs to faulty communications. The rhetoric and promised action never get translated into real benefits for the people at the local level. The colonizer cannot understand the needs, frustrations, and insecurities of the colonized because he has never been locked as a life member into reserve or colony or processed by the ghetto. On the other hand, the native has never had the freedom of the bureaucrat, who has various alternatives and occupational opportunities, or experienced power over others. These two levels are separated by a structure of power. The colonizer will never allow his power to diminish. At the same time, the colonized acknowledges and submits to the authority of the colonizer. The colonizer cannot give any of his power permanently to the colonized, because such gifts can be taken back by the colonizer whenever he wishes. The native would have to seize power, hold on to it, and not share it again with the oppressor. As a result, the oppressor continues to operate at his comfortable level of rhetoric and promises, while the native is locked into a daily struggle for existence, uninformed about, or at least indifferent to the colonizer's rhetorical promises of improvement. This dual level of operation was particularly obvious at the level of the treaty negotiations, when the white man made lavish promises to induce the Indians to surrender their land. But the reality of these negotiations was that the Indians lost their land and their rights with very little compensation, except for small plots of land known as reserves. A modern example of this principle is Sunday morning Mass. The priest sermonizes extensively on brotherhood and love of mankind, but this same priest later in the week segregates the native people from the whites in the community theater. Only the white people are allowed to sit in the main floor front seats, while the Indians and Métis are personally commanded by this father to sit in the back row or upstairs in inferior seating accommodation. There were many isolated Indian resistance battles during the period of relocation to reserves. However, Indians were unable to mobilize a major united resistance because of their weakened economic and political position. In 1873, Ottawa established a permanent occupation force of mounted police in the northwest that could immediately crush any people's movement that might arise or threaten the Ottawa regime, and served as a constant reminder of Ottawa's absolute power. As a further injustice, the government also took back reserve land from the Indians and then sold it to the land speculators. Mr. Oliver, the Minister of Indian Affairs in charge, heard some plain truths about his administration. The opposition members severely criticized the notorious deal by which the department assisted a group of speculators to get the rich lands of St. Peter's Reserve in Manitoba from the Indians for a very inadequate price. Mr. Armstrong, a member of the opposition, said this was not an isolated case. The Laurier government had sold 700,000 acres of Indian land to speculators, much of it for 10 and 15 cents an acre. Treaties made Indian subjugation look honorable, or at least legal. There was little doubt about the underlying purpose of treaties. Treaty 6 states that all Indians do hereby cede, release, surrender, and yield up to the government forever all their rights, titles, and privileges whatsoever to the lands included. The tract of land referred to embraced an area of 121,000 square miles. In case the first clause failed to make it clear, another clause was added to the surrender, and also all their rights, titles, and privileges whatsoever to all other lands, wherever situated in the Northwest Territories. Indians had no say in choosing the site for the reserve. The Superintendent of Indian Affairs shall delegate and send a suitable person to determine and set apart the land for each reserve. This is one policy the government carried out faithfully. In return for their land, Indians received very little. Terms of the treaty state that Indians extinguish all claims heretofore, and the government makes them a present of $12 for each man, woman, and child. Thus, Indians sold all their rights, titles, and privileges to their aboriginal land for $12 in cash, an annual treaty payment of $5, and confinement to a stony compound. Treaty money of $5 a year certainly looks like conscious money. However, it has a deeper purpose than that. This charity has a tremendous influence in creating and retaining within Native people a psychological dependency, which, in turn, encourages attitudes of subservience and gratitude. These factors are essential in maintaining effective control over colonized people. By the same treaty, Indians also surrendered their hunting and fishing rights. Indians shall have the right to pursue their avocations of hunting and fishing throughout the tract surrendered, subject to such regulations as made by her government. The federal government, therefore, has constitutional authority to make regulations prohibiting Indians from hunting and fishing at any time. One clause in the treaty states that the government will pay a sum of $1,500 per annum per reserve for the purchase of ammunition and twine, but it has rarely been honored. Some Indians are trying to claim this sum of money today. Indians must adhere to certain conditions set down in the treaty. In addition to total surrender of their land, titles, and rights, Indians have duties whereby they promise and engage that they will, in all respects, obey and abide by the law, and they will maintain peace and good order. They will aid and assist the officers of Her Majesty in bringing justice and punishment to any Indian offending against the stipulations of this treaty or infringing the laws in force in the country so ceded. Not only were they forced to obey the oppressive laws of their colonizer, but they were required to act as stool pigeons against their people. A tragic consequence of the treaties was that Indians later accepted them as a kind of legal Bible, which they felt gave them special right and privileges. This attitude persists with most Indians today. Not only do the treaties represent cruel thefts of Aboriginal rights, but they are also contracts of continuing oppression. When Indians hold the treaties as sacred testaments, the process of colonization is indeed complete. Indians possess a certain political awareness today, but they still cling to the illusion dating from the time of the treaties. But they have citizen plus status. Indians were not citizens, were judged incapable of participation in society as civilized people, and were denied even the basic right of voting in elections. In fact, they became citizens only in 1961. This is unmistakable evidence as to how the Canadian people and their government regarded the Indians in terms of political civilization. Stanley's statement, which is contradictory in itself, nevertheless is probably typical of the Canadian mentality towards Indians. On the whole, Canada has followed the tradition of the imperial government in its relations with Native tribes, and has endeavored to deal fairly with her Aboriginal wards. More than 4 centuries after white men brought democratic civilization to North America, the Canadian Indian was still denied his democratic voting right, and he was being treated as an Aboriginal ward, as recently as 1961. There are few white supremacy countries that surpass Canada's shameful record in political discrimination. This shows the deep state of colonization of the Canadian Indians who accept this denial of rights for 400 years. It is not surprising, therefore, that many Indians held off as long as they could from entering their concentration camps. Little Pine and his band have nothing to depend on, are selling their horses to buy food, and as they cannot last long, they will soon become so reduced in circumstances as to be glad to fulfill their part of the conditions and settle on the reserves. Some prefer to die fighting for their independence rather than die on the reserve later from starvation. Chief Yellow Calf and 75 members of his tribe in the Fort Capel area refused to go to their reserve and decided to fight it out with their colonizers. Their resistance against the police lasted for 2 months, but when additional police and troopers were brought in from Regina, they were finally crushed and put on their reserve at gunpoint. Indians could see the economic conditions on reserves would mean a slow death. In some cases, death did not come slowly. A Cree Indian says that his mother, brother, and children died of starvation, and that his wife, wary of the suffering she was enduring, shot herself. By 1880, most of the native people had been herded into reserves and colonies where oppression, misery, and death plagued them. A priest of the North Battleford area, wrote about the conditions of the Indians in 1883. The cakes made with some bad flour did not satisfy the appetite of the Indians. I saw the gaunt children, dying of hunger, come to my place. Although it was 30 to 40 below zero, their bodies were scarcely covered with torn rags. Later, this same priest illustrated the protection Indians received when they held their tribal meetings. All families had gone to join bands for a religious meeting at the edge of Battle River. Later, 30 policemen arrived. Later, another 30, and again some. There seems to be an endless supply of mounted police at native settlements, but although the federal government could provide scores of Mounties, it could not provide funds or foods for starving Indians. The Canadian government's subjugation policy was just as devastating as the extermination method employed in the United States, according to the same North Battleford priest. The Dominion government intends to carry out a starvation policy with the Indians. Then we will be no better than our cousins across the line, whom we condemn so lustily for their extermination policy. The colonial administration of the federal government divided each Plains Indian tribe into several small bands and then appointed a chief for each band. Consistent with colonization principles, Indians Affairs agents made a practice of sowing dissension by exaggerating band and tribal differences, so that native people were led to believe that neighboring Indians and Métis were mean, cruel, and unfriendly. This systematic colonization makes colonized people suspicious of their neighbors, while the colonizers appear peaceful and civilized. The colonizer encourages the different colonial groups to distrust each other and thus keep them divided and isolated, weaker and easier to control. Since colonizers hold all the power and influence, they are able to manipulate the kind and degree of hostility that will exist in the native community. For the Indians, reserve life meant the end of basic freedoms such as speech, assembly, franchise, and civil rights. They were not even allowed to leave the reserve without written permission from the government agent, who could grant or deny a pass on the basis of personal whim. The pass permitted the Indian to go only to the place specified on the pass, and he had to return to his reserve at the time stated by the agent. This official had the right to ask any question about the Indian's leave, and any uncooperativeness meant that the Indian was automatically denied future passes. It is not difficult to imagine how this would be absurd, particularly with regard to women. Indians obtained no relief from their chief, even when they elected him themselves, since the pressures exerted on them to elect subservient Uncle Tomahawk chiefs were enormous. These chiefs represented the ideology and policies of the Indian Affairs branch, and tended to be conservative and obedient servants to the Indian agents, helping to impose upon their people ideas and programs that would keep them in a colonized state.